Welcome to Your Life in 10, Bournbrook's new podcast series in which we go beyond politics and discuss what really matters. I'm S D Wickett, and I'll talk to esteemed guests about their favourite books, music, films and more. Our first guest is the writer and firefighter Paul Embery. So, Paul, prior to becoming a well-known writer and politico, you were a firefighter. How did that come about?
Well, I'm still a firefighter, actually. It's still my day job, and it's my primary job, and everything else really I have to kind of fit around that. So I've been a firefighter for, it will be 24 years at the end of this year. And I was very active in the fire brigades union, became active in the union shortly after becoming a professional firefighter. And so that's the background to my politics in many ways. And, you know, through my activity through the union, it kind of led me down other avenues, and I've ended up with a column and, you know, the occasional media appearance and things like that. But yeah, primarily I'm a firefighter, and it's important that I never forget that.
Yeah. Does your attachment to that as a profession, has it taken a hit at all with your sort of with your split from the union?
No, not really. The whole business with the FBU was messy and disappointing and unnecessary and politically motivated. I think that's pretty clear to most people looking from the outside in.
Absolutely.
But you know, I've always retained my employment with my fire brigade employer, so that's continued, fortunately. So I'm back on the tools, as it were.
Wonderful. Was it something that you always wanted to do?
Firefighting?
Yeah.
Well, I wouldn't say necessarily always, but certainly from probably my teenage years. I remember going to, when you're about 14 or 15, my school, as probably most schools did, sent us on a careers convention at the local town hall. And I'd always been sort of quite sporty, quite active. I was always playing football and cricket and whatnot. And the London Fire Brigade had a stall at this convention, and I got talking to a couple of the guys, and it was something that really appealed to me. So at quite an early opportunity, I took the opportunity to join.
So you've been a firefighter since '97. You said it's 24 years, right? Okay.
Yes. Right.
So I'm only slightly older than your career as a firefighter.
That worries me.
As a working class lad from, you know, East London, sort of Essex border region, did you feel your options were limited per se? I mean, you entered the workforce just before Blair's whole thing about sending everyone to university came into fruition. Did you feel that as someone who's of the working class, you were limited for options?
It's probably quite a bit before Blair came to power, actually. I mean, I first entered the world of work in 1991 when I was 16,
Right.
and did a couple of office kind of jobs before I joined the fire service. And no, I didn't particularly feel at the time that my horizons were limited, because I didn't really know any better. But looking back, actually, yeah, I mean, unquestionably, they were. I mean, I can't really remember any teacher talking to me about going to university. I mean, that was a completely alien world to me, and to, I guess, most other kids at my school. I went to a kind of bog standard Catholic comprehensive school in Dagenham, and I'm not really aware of any of my sort of former schoolmates who went to university. Some of them may have done, but I'm not aware of them. Most of them, you know, may have sort of stayed on to do their A levels, but you know, most I think quickly went out into the world of work. So it was kind of just, you know, that's what you did where I grew up. It's what my parents did. It's what I did, and it's only later in life really when you understand a bit more about that other side of things and the world of universities and stuff that you think, actually, you know, there was not much done to encourage people like me and my school friends to even consider university, really. And I'm not saying necessarily I would have gone down that path, but perhaps it would have been nice to have had an opportunity, but no, it just didn't happen, and that's.
Yeah, sometimes I do feel as if I may have been happier or at least more secure financially if I'd not gone to university and if I'd done sort of an apprenticeship. But again, I was sort of coming out of college in sort of 2014, so that was kind of that was when it was it was the done thing. But we're here to discuss your tastes. Would you say you have like one sort of fixed taste in say music or film, or is it like is it just whatever you like?
Yeah, no, I wouldn't say. I like jazz when it comes to music, and it's only really in later years that I've got into jazz. I mean, I'm certainly no connoisseur, I must say that. But when I was a kid, I had no interest in it at all. One of my friends said it was just instrument noise, jazz. That's how he described it, and I can see why someone might say that, and that's probably how I looked upon it as a younger person. But where I worked in Islington for many years at Islington Fire Station, and there were a great kind of number of pubs and clubs around the area. One particular pub used to do regular jazz nights, live jazz bands, quartets and stuff. And after a while of listening to it, you kind of really get into it and you appreciate the sound of it. So I guess if I had to choose a particular musical genre, I'd probably go for that one, but without being expert about it.
Right. Yeah. It's one of those things where it's sort of like beer and coffee, where you kind of you sort of just age into it, right? You sort of I remember being a kid and having a bit of my dad's beer and thinking it was just horrible, horrible. But then come 18, 19, I loved it.
Yeah,
one of those things. Yeah.
So it's an acquired taste, I think.
So what sort of things were you listening to in 91 when you were first sort of leaving school?
Oh God, I mean, probably just the charts, really. I mean, I used to do that thing which I think probably every teenager used to do around that time, where you listen to the top 40 on Radio 1 on a Sunday afternoon, and rather than buy the individual records, you just get the set and record the top 40 chart, which I think lasted for about 3 hours. And then you just play the cassette. So yeah, I mean, it was just really the music at the time, I guess, that I was listening to.
So what would that have been? Would that have been like Britpop and?
I think it was probably before. I mean, certainly before the sort of Blur and Oasis kind of stuff, which came in the mid 90s, I think it was. So around the time, it was probably the Pet Shop Boys or the Communards, and I mean, I'm not saying I was particularly into those bands, but that was the kind of thing that was in the charts at the time. Duran, that's probably a bit earlier, I guess.
Yeah. I'm glad to mention Duran. My I think because I think it's common for your parent, especially if they're into music themselves, to try and get you into what excited them when they were your age. So yeah, my unfortunately my dad did try and fail to get me into Duran, but he managed to get me into some things, like Al Jarreau was a big thing he got me into.
Yeah, well, I kind of in more recent years, I mean, I really like Frank Sinatra, and I wouldn't have given you house room for him 20 years ago, I guess. And people like Billie Holiday, you could listen to Billie Holiday all day long. She's the most wonderful singer. So you do, I think, as you get older, you do perhaps look back a bit further and appreciate some of the music from before your own time in a way that you don't when you're young, particularly.
There's a very sad story with Billie Holiday, and it kind of adds a sort of a context to the music, because you're right, she's a beautiful voice, but when you read about her life and sort of how I suppose bleak it was at times, it sort of that beauty kind of takes on like a sort of a dimension of pain too, which kind of elevates it a little bit to me.
There's a really good film that's came out, I think, fairly recently, which I watched the other day, the United States versus Billie Holiday. And Billie Holiday so it's all about her run-ins with the authorities in the US and her drug abuse and stuff. But it was an okay film. But Andra Day, who plays Billie Holiday, who's a fantastic singer in her own right, played the part particularly well. So I'd certainly recommend that as a film.
What is the first record on your list?
The first album is Pure by The Lightning Seeds, which is, I think that came out around 1995, 96. And in that 25 years, I would say played it incessantly, really. I got into it first because I went on holiday to Crete with some mates to Malia, and a mate had the album and just CD as it was in those days, and just played it pretty much non-stop for the week. So I kind of picked up on it as well, and it's just really a collection of kind of cheery summer tunes, I would say. And yeah, that would have been 96 that I first listened to it, and just after that, a couple of months later was the Euro 96 football championships, where the Lightning Seeds did the theme song.
With Bedine and Skinner. Yeah.
So that kind of tied in with it quite well. So that's probably an album I've played more than any other over the years, I think.
Mm-hmm. It's so it's fronted by Ian Browdy, right?
Ian Brody.
Yeah. So cause he's interesting. So he's I'm not sure if you know this, but he was in a band called Big in Japan, who were big in sort of the Liverpool punk scene in the sort of 70s. And what's interesting about them is that the band didn't really go anywhere, but all of the members went on to do like much bigger things. I think one of the guys from Frankie Goes to Hollywood was in Big in Japan. One of the guys from I can't remember what they were called. They made like a lot of parody songs, and they got into like Top of the Pops and that sort of thing. But it's an interesting band because it was like an incubator for sort of
yeah. I don't know much about Big in Japan, but I think he was because he also produced a lot of albums as well for other bands and was involved with other bands, Echo and the Bunnymen, I think.
Yeah.
Well. So yeah, no, and you don't really hear about. I think they're still going, but you don't really hear about them anymore. But that was, I think, that was quite a popular album at the time.
It's funny, isn't it, how Liverpool has its musical heritage extends way beyond the Beatles, but that's sort of what you think of when you think of the music of Liverpool.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, I imagine most people associate the Beatles obviously with Liverpool. That's the first thing that comes to mind. But I guess I mean Jerry Marsden and people like that, and the 1960s scene, it was particularly big, wasn't it, Liverpool?
What's your second record?
So the second one is the album Raintown by Deacon Blue, who I would probably say my favourite band, Scottish band. Lead singer Ricky Ross is from Dundee, but they've got very much a kind of Glasgow feel, and it was the album Raintown in about '87, I think it was, that kind of launched them really onto the scene. And I particularly like it. If you look at the album cover from memory, it's kind of a black and white, the landscape of industrial Glasgow, and it's got that feel about all the tracks as well. It's very sort of industrial, very kind of gritty.
Yeah, the album cover, the cover, if I recall, is quite smoky, and there's like a crane, and I haven't listened to it properly in a very long time. I do like the record. It's and you're right, and lyrically it's quite cool. It's sort of conceptual in a way, in that the songs are all about kind of urban life and
it's quite political. I mean, the songs on. I mean, Dignity is probably the flagship song from this. Probably their flagship song of all time, I would think, which is about a guy who is just an ordinary guy who works for the council, but he's been saving up for years to buy a boat, which he wants to use to sail around the Western Isles. But there's also songs like "He Looks Like Spencer Tracy Now," which was quite a political song about the dropping of the atom bomb on Japan and stuff like that. So yeah, it kind of chimes with my politics in some ways. I've seen them live a few times. They're a pretty decent outfit, I
think. That's good. That's good when you see a band and it does the record justice. But I've gone to see a lot of bands where they've just been crap live, and it's really sort of spoiled my ability to enjoy them.
Deacon Blue, I have to say, are really good live. I've seen them about half a dozen times live, and they've been really good on each occasion.
Right. So the record opens with quite an odd track. Is it Born in the Storm or Born in a Storm or something like that?
That's right. Yeah,
Yeah,
that's right. Yeah, that's true. That's a very short number, I think.
yeah. It's very like atmospheric and
Yeah,
gloomy, and it sort of it feels like you're listening to like a foggy sort of grey city, right?
yeah, that's about right. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and I very much like records that are able to capture a time and place quite well, and it's
Mm.
I'm not I don't personally know a whole lot about the sort of Glasgow during the Thatcher years, but I can imagine it's not too dissimilar from someone like Sheffield or Sunderland or
Yeah, I mean, it was obviously, once upon a time heavily industrialized
mm,
Glasgow. See the shipyards, for example, the number of people who worked on the shipyards and the prominence of the shipyards, the River Clyde, quite political, Red
mm,
Clydeside and that kind of thing. Big Labour Party presence in the place, but suffered in the 80s the kind of deindustrialisation from Thatcherite policies largely that many other cities faced as well. So it certainly had its tough moments.
mm. Yeah, and it I suppose it naturally creates good music. There's more inspiration to be found in kind of misery than joy, I feel.
Yeah, it's probably true in some respects. Yeah.
What's your third record?
So the third one is a soundtrack. Actually, it's a soundtrack to the film The Mission, which is a great film. I think it came out in the 80s with Jeremy Irons and Robert De Niro, and it's about Christian missionaries essentially going to convert the indigenous peoples of South America. But the soundtrack was by the composer Ennio Morricone.
Right, who did the Good, the Bad, and the Ugly?
That's right.
Yeah,
Once
yeah,
upon a time in America
yeah.
and all sorts of stuff over the years, and sadly died a couple of years ago. But I had the good fortune to go to one of his concerts at the Royal Albert Hall 15, 20 years ago. But I've got a particular reason because there's a piece of music from. It's a lovely album, very much sort of written in the native style as well of South America and some of the sort of indigenous people's instruments and stuff. But when we got married, my wife walked up the aisle to one of the tunes on it, Gabriel's Oboe, which is a fantastic piece of music. You'd hear it if you switched on Classic FM. You'd hear it every now and then. So it's a wonderful kind of album, but at the same time, it's got some personal meaning as well.
Mm, mm. Morricone is, yeah. I mean, I believe he died during the first lockdown.
Oh, okay.
I think it was, yeah, it was either last year or the year before, but yeah, he's a phenomenal composer.
Mm.
And it's a point you made about him using sort of native sounds. Because I mean, he's pretty best known for doing the soundtrack for the spaghetti westerns and the Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. It's well, there's nothing like it. I mean, people have tried to like kind of replicate that, but the sound and the feel of it, I think it elevates the film. And I'm aware we're talking about a different film here, but
Yeah, I haven't seen it actually.
yeah.
I haven't seen it. I really ought to have done. I know, but I haven't seen it.
I highly recommend it. Actually, so later on in the series, I'm going to be the guest on this show, and that's my pick for best film.
Okay.
Yeah, it's holistically, it's just such a fantastic film in terms of like the how it's shot, how it's acted, how it's written, how it sounds. It's a music. Is the is the film as sort of highly regarded to you as the soundtrack as well?
Yeah, the film's excellent. I haven't seen it for many years, but it's excellent. I think it won the Palme d'Or award, I think, and was nominated for various awards, and it was very sort of highly acclaimed. So I would, yeah, I'd thoroughly recommend it.
What is the first book on your list?
So the first book is The Ragged Trousered Philanthropists,
Yeah, okay.
which is a classic in many ways. And I'm somebody who's on the left. I'm someone who's come up through the trade union movement, and this is, for many people, this is the Bible of socialism. This is an introduction in many respects to a critique of the capitalist system, and it's about a chap, a painter and decorator called Frank Owen, who strives to kind of win his. I think it was published in the.
It's like 1910s, right?
I
Sort of.
was going to say, yeah, probably in the second decade of the last century, and yeah, he kind of strives to win his colleagues to the cause of socialism, and the importance of organising in the workplace. And he doesn't actually have very much success, but he kind of it has its faults, to be honest. Some of the attitude towards his fellow workers that's expressed is quite sneering and mocking. But as a critique of the capitalist system at the time, and the importance of workers binding together and using their collective strength to organize and to win better conditions for themselves. Conditions at work in those days were obviously pretty awful for many people. It's a hugely important tract. So yeah, that's the first choice.
What's interesting about that as a story is that the author himself is of that background, right? I think the author actually was a house painter.
Robert Trestle, that's right. Yeah.
Whereas if you compare it to some of the sort of late Victorian critiques of capitalism, being say Disraeli in the novel Sybil, or Dickens in basically any of his works, it feels more kind of authentic. It's someone who's sort of lived it, right?
Yeah, it was almost like it was written through his own eyes and own experiences, really. And the sad thing is, I think in Princeton said he wasn't around to see it published. He tried to get it published, and he didn't manage to see it published. And it became a very prominent book only after it died.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I haven't read it in a long time, but I remember loving the dialogue in that novel. It's sort of like again, I don't know. It's like it sort of throws to the curb the sort of the more pretentious prose of the sort of more established authors, and it just feels more grounded.
It's quite authentic, yeah. I mean, because that was his background, that was his environment. Those were the people he mixed with. I think that in terms of the dialogue and the interactions and the language and whatever, that certainly comes through.
Yeah, so it was probably written around the time that the Labour Party was first sort of coming up, right?
Yeah, because you had the Labour Representation Committee, which was formed in 1900, which was the forerunner to the Labour Party, which came about formally in 1906. It took a couple of decades for the Labour Party to form its first government, but certainly around about that time, after there was the split with the Liberals, the ideas of the Labour Party and of democratic socialism were I think being discussed more widely among workers than before. So yes, I mean it goes hand in hand, I think, with that period.
The Labour movement seems to have lost that kind of that sort of working men in work sort of discussing those ideas. It now seems to be sort of treated as a sermon of sort of slightly more middle class people, so trying to direct the revolution rather than a sort of an authentic groundswell. Yeah,
and I think that's partly, I mean, it's certainly true, and I think that's partly to do with the fact that deindustrialization has meant that there aren't as many trade unionists around now than there compared to days gone by, and the trade union movement, for example, in terms of membership has halved over the last 40 years. So you don't have that kind of political trade union movement and workers discussing things in the workplace and taking decisions and organising in the way that you did. And that is I think that's a huge problem, because when you look at the emergence of the gig economy, and 0 hours contracts and precarious employment, I think that trade unions are needed as much as they ever were, but for all sorts of reasons, they're not in the lives of many people, and I think that's really sad.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's there's a big sort of demoralizing effect too, where whereas prior to say Thatcher and the deindustrialization of the late last century, the sort of jobs that the working class had were, you know, honourable, inherit, you know, intergenerational jobs that
Mm.
supplied, you know, status without having to go through sort of the ringer of university. Nowadays, it seems like the quote unquote working class is sort of more common in you know in the services industry than in industry.
And we sneer, we sneer at vocation, we sneer at blue collar jobs, we sneer at people, getting a trade, which once upon a time would have been a source of pride to someone, but now everybody is kind of expected to be crammed through university, and all the people involved in manual labour or skilled labour, whether they're electricians or plumbers or whatever, we just kind of import from abroad because it's a cheap way of doing it, and then suddenly we find that we've got enormous numbers of kids going through universities who are coming out, and their degrees sadly are not worth much, not through any lack of effort on their part, but because there's just so many people in the same boat, and you hear stories of people who've been to university and are working, in shops and stuff. And I'm not decrying that. I believe there's dignity in all labour, but you shouldn't kind of mislead people about what going to university will deliver. So I think our kind of obsession with putting people through university and looking down on the importance of vocation has cost us quite dearly.
What's your second book?
The second one is a classic, really, but not many people in this country, I don't think, have read it. It's called Independent People, and it was written by an Icelandic author back in the 30s called Halldór Laxness. And it's a story about a sheep farmer. I mean, when I describe it to you, it's probably not going to sell it at all. It's about a sheep farmer called Bjarta of Summer Houses, and about his fight in raising a family and the challenges that are presented by economic exploitation and the kind of unforgiving Icelandic landscape, as you can imagine. But it's a story about family, about self-sacrifice, about resilience, and when you kind of read that as a synopsis, you may well think it's not for me, but actually it's an epic. It's really a fantastic book, and I'd recommend it to everybody. It's one of the fascinating things I find about it actually is it was translated by a guy called J.A. Thompson, who I've never heard of in any other context at all. I read somewhere that he was a lecturer in Iceland. So he knew the language, but when he was in this country, he was working at a petrol station in the northeast somewhere, and yet he produced this absolute masterpiece translation of this epic story, and then kind of disappeared off the scene. So I've always kind of been fascinated about finding out more of him, but without success. But I genuinely recommend it. It's a brilliant book.
Well, I'm not aware of this book, sadly. It sounds like, so you said, an epic novel about the Icelandic sort of agrarian life. It sounds like to make a possibly awful comparison, it sounds like almost whenever I've read Dostoevsky or even Tolstoy, where the sort of Russia is almost a character of its own, right? The wilderness and the setting is almost its own character.
Yeah, and I mean Iceland's like that. I mean, but it's got an incredible history. I mean, it's actually reportedly the first country to have a proper sort of functioning parliament, and it's got an incredible sort of literary history as well. The Icelandic sagas and things like that. So it's not the thing you would necessarily associate with that country. You just sort of think of this bleak landscape, which is snow and ice with a few towns dotted around the edge. But actually, that history is really worth exploring, and the literary history of it as well, definitely.
Going again, because sadly I'm not aware of it all, but going off the title alone, I can assume that independence is quite a strong theme in the story. Just out of curiosity, how old were you when you read it?
I first read it quite a few years ago now. I mean, I can't remember exactly when, but it was probably a decade ago.
Okay.
I read it, but I've read it since. I read it again during lockdown, actually, because that was probably appropriate. And yeah, it is an epic. It's a long book, but some of the language is beautiful, pure poetry. So it's really worth seeking out.
Yeah, I'll definitely add it to my list. It sounds like a really sort of quite powerful theme, right? Independence and sort of self-sufficient and kind of self-determination on the land. So yeah, I'll look forward to.
And of course, these were days and places that existed before any kind of functioning modern welfare state, and people where people couldn't survive through their own efforts. They often had to rely on charity, but often, and this is very much the theme of this story, people were too proud in many respects to take charity. And here was a guy trying to raise a family in the most unforgiving circumstances, but was absolutely determined to try to succeed. And I won't tell you the ending, but yeah, it comes recommended by me.
What is the how did you feel about the protagonist while you were reading it?
Yes, sympathetic actually.
Yeah, is it someone who is sympathetic, but also it's almost elevated, and you can kind of look up to that sort of character?
I mean, it was kind of, yeah, I think so. It was a guy who had an enormous sense of pride, who was raising or trying to raise a family, and was trying to to make his farm, his land successful and pay for him in the most difficult economic and environmental circumstances. Fighting against the elements. And it's set in the years leading up to the First World War, so you can kind of imagine how difficult it was during that period.
Right. Sure.
And then some of it after the First World War as well.
Wonderful. Yeah, I'll definitely look into it. I do quite like the storytelling that comes out of Northern Europe as a whole, but Nordic countries have a very interesting narrative tradition. But we'll move along again to your third and final book.
Well, the third one is Captain Corelli's Mandolin, which is obviously a good old-fashioned love story set against the backdrop of the Second World War. Italian army has obviously launched an invasion of Greece. They've occupied Kefalonia, one of the Greek islands, and the Italian captain Corelli falls in love with the daughter of a local doctor. She herself has got a fiance away fighting with the Greek army against the Italians. So there's all kind of themes of love and war and divided loyalties and whatever. But Louis de Bernière, I think, just writes it so beautifully. It's so beautifully written. And again, for the few people, I guess, who haven't read it, I won't spoil the end, but there's a massacre involved somewhere, and it was made into a film, and it was actually massacred itself. The book was massacred by the film, because the film really wasn't good at all. It had Nicolas Cage in the lead role, and that was John Hurt, who played the Doctor, was brilliant, but I think other people were just really miscast. But the book itself is I think exceptional.
Yeah, and there's from what I can recall, there's sort of there's good love and there's bad love in the story. There's one of the relationships is sort of just kind of lust that it burns out after the war, right?
It's fascinating, because I don't want to give away the ending, but yeah, I mean, there's a kind of losing of contact, but then many years down the line you can kind of imagine what happens again. Without kind of revealing the ending too much. But I went to Kefalonia, where it's set a couple of years ago, and sadly it was hit by an earthquake, actually, in I think 1953. So much of that Kefalonia, and it was a really serious earthquake. The only bit of the island I think that survived it was the northern part, a kind of town called Fiscado. But it's the most beautiful island as well. So it's the great backdrop to the brilliant story.
There's a quote from that book. It's the only actual bit of line that I actually clearly remember from the page to my memory. It's the character of the doctor. Love is what is left when the passion goes.
Yeah, and there's actually, and there's no way I can remember it all off the top of my head, because it was quite a few years ago that I read it. But there's this, I think, quite early on in the book, where he talks, love is not a passing fad. It's, your two trees, and you need to, you need to make sure your roots entwine. And it's almost like an epic poem, actually. So yeah, it's worth seeking out just for that alone. It was quite beautiful.
It's another thing too, isn't it? So the novel places both fascism and communism in its sights, right? It's sort of lambasted two of them.
Yeah, very, very critical of the communists who were around at the time. And whenever I say to people on the left that I really enjoyed it as a book, there'll always be some of them who will say, it's an anti-communist, but yeah, equally of fascism as well. So I think it's very difficult for an author to write a book about such a historical event as that, and not necessarily bring their own kind of political prejudices to it in a way. But in many respects, I think that's secondary to the greater part of the book, which is just basically an old-fashioned love story.
Yeah, and also there's a sort of platonic love in there too, and I don't mean platonic as in like love between friends. I mean it as a love and something sort of inanimate, right? Like music is quite heavily used, and there's sort of an interesting thing about how sort of beauty can arise from tragedy and chaos.
Yeah, and the music obviously is centered around the mandolin, which I think Louis de Bernier, the author, actually plays himself.
Right.
So he was able to bring that expertise to it. And obviously the captain in the story, is a great player of the instrument too. So that features quite heavily. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a wonderfully unique instrument, and yeah, I love the way it's played. It sort of well, I don't know anything about playing music, but yeah, I just know that I like the way mandolin.
Well, I had when I used to work at fire station at Islington Fire Station, one of my firefighter colleagues played the mandolin, and you could often, when you were walking around the station on duty, you would often hear the mandolin striking up in various places in the locker room or in the office or something, and you do get to appreciate the sound of it. He was quite average, but nonetheless, it's a great instrument.
Yeah. Okay. So let's move on to film. So we've done three books, three records. So, but we're only giving you one film this time around. So, what's your film?
So the film, this was a tough one, actually. I mean, I've got quite a few favourite films. I mean, I love American Werewolf in London, which was a horror movie from the early 80s. I love it's an old film from the 40s, I think it was, Bicycle Thieves, which is
Italian film,
Italian sort of social realist film. It's a very sad story, but I've gone for a fairly recent film, actually, Midnight in Paris, which was written and directed by Woody Allen.
Yeah, it's a fantastic film. Yeah,
Wilson in the main role, and I've kind of long been a bit of a Francophile, and so it was right up my street, really. And Wilson plays a writer in modern day Paris. He's able to sort of finds a way of traveling back in time to the Paris of the 20s. He meets all the prominent people who were around there at the time, Scott Fitzgerald, Cole Porter, Ernest Hemingway, people like that. And it's magnificently shot, and he goes to parties with them back in the day, and they play the music of the time. So it kind of it strengthened my Francophilia, I guess.
Yeah, it's well, it's such a fascinating time. The Lost Generation, or these American expats in Paris, and I think I don't know the name of the actor, but the guy who played Hemingway, to me, completely stole the show.
Yeah, he was really good. I don't know his name either, but he did play the role very well.
Yeah, he gets the cold and blunt and very masculine prose of Hemingway kind of perfectly in the role. And another thing that's quite interesting about the film is towards the end, when he realizes that the people in the 20s look back at like the 1890s.
Yeah, and he goes back there too, doesn't he?
Yeah. So I mean, also I'm pretty sure the novel he's writing is about nostalgia, right?
Yeah, I think so. It is to a certain degree. It's slightly kind of whimsical, but the it's just, I think it's beautifully shot. The music is fantastic. It's very, very well acted. And for that alone, and the shot particularly of, it's called Midnight in Paris, Paris in the Rain, as well, towards the end, is just quite spectacular. Michael Sheen pops up in it too, of course, and he's always decent.
Yes. He plays the pretentious
That's right. Yeah.
professor. Yeah.
So the stuff that he appears in tends to be quite good as well. So it's a good all round film. I don't think it's got any weaknesses at all.
There's a part in that film that I really like where he meets the surrealists, and he's telling them about that he's from the future. He's been sent back to Paris, and they aren't even remotely surprised.
That's right. It's completely normal to them, isn't it?
Yeah.
Salvador Dali and stuff pop up.
Yeah. It's there's a really great bit where him and Hemingway are in this like car, and Hemingway's telling him about this thing he saw in the war, and then he does this sort of whole spiel about how like love and passion and sex can sort of cure you of your fear of death temporarily, and it's it's I'm not sure how much of that was lifted from Hemingway. I haven't honestly read that much Hemingway, but I can imagine it was sort of somewhat faithful. But also Woody Allen's a very good sentimental filmmaker. I mean, typically New York is sort of the object of his affections, but he I think he's very good at capturing a city in a sort of romantic light. Right?
Yeah, he did this brilliantly, I must say. Yeah.
So the next item on the list is I think probably one of the hardest to sort of to pin down, because it really just goes down to your personality, really. But it's the inanimate object.
I mean, I don't know if this is technically inanimate, actually, but I'll go for it anyway. It's a personal thing, a personal object that's been in the family for many years, and it belonged to my grandparents, and it's an old kind of floor standing radiogram from the early 1950s.
Wow.
It's a Murphy 146. You can Google it and see a Murphy 146 radio, and it's obviously it was the main source of entertainment and information for people back then. I think in the early 50s when it was produced, and it's incredibly heavy. But when my grandmother died and we were doing the kind of usual house clearance, nobody wanted to throw this away because it had been in the family for so long. And my dad and his siblings had sat around listening to it when they were young, etc. And so I ended up with it, and it's quite an attractive thing, and it's been sitting in my living room for some years now, and it still works. So you can it takes a while for the valves to kick in, but you can still get a decent sound out of it. So and I think things like that are important, to pass things like that down the family, because it is, a reminder of relatives who are no longer around, really. And because I think radios in those days were such as I said, a central part of people's lives, it's got particular value, I think.
Yeah, I'm looking at it now. It's a really awkwardly shaped thing.
It's not the most beautiful thing, but it's
it looks like it'd be very difficult to like move from
it is. It's heavy.
one spot to another. Is there any way you can like grip it?
Not really. No, you just have to.
So I have to like hug it and then
shuffle it around. Yeah.
So you could listen to like Radio 1 on that thing now.
Yeah, I mean, it'd be a bit odd listening to Radio 1 on it simply because of what it is, but you probably more likely listen to a bit of jazz on it or something like that, I guess. But yeah, I mean, it still kicks out a sound even now. I think things were built to last more in those days, weren't they?
Is it something that you then look to sort of hand down yourself?
I hadn't really thought about that, to be honest. I mean, it's really not worth any particularly in monetary value. But it'd be nice to, I guess it'd be nice to have it in the family for as long as possible, really. Yeah.
Yeah, but I suppose the idea of not handing things down and just sort of giving them away is a fairly recent phenomenon. I mean, for the lion's share of history of like civilization, it's been customary to keep things in the family, like even something little as like a little locket or watch, something like that. But Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't mind if my dad gave me one of those.
Yeah, yeah. But there you go. It's yeah, it kind of evokes memories of yesteryear, really.
Mm.
And so I kind of, I've got a couple of kids, and I turn it on every now and then. I imagine the thought of them just having an evening's entertainment, sitting around listening to it. They kind of think, "What? We want to be on our Xbox or watching Netflix or whatever." But
All right.
yeah, it's a connection with the past, and it's
Mm.
not a bad thing for that alone, I think.
Yeah, you need that. You need that. So let's move on to the last two items, which I personally think are the most interesting for picking a person's brain. Which is, we'll start with your historical figure.
Well, there's kind of a crossover really between the two, between the historical figure and the contemporary figure. So the historical figure was Pope Leo XIII, I think it was, who wrote an encyclical in 1891 called Rerum Novarum, which was at the time a kind of modern expression of Catholic social teaching. And I mean, I'm not a practicing Catholic, but I went to a Catholic school, so I'm kind of well versed in the whole kind of culture of the thing. And this particular encyclical dealt with the plight of the working classes. It was quite critical of unfettered capitalism. It talks about the importance of justice in the workplace. It was quite a groundbreaking document at the time. It gave an explicit endorsement of collective bargaining, the right to form trade unions, etc. How it's important we don't look upon human beings as commodities, that economies should work in the interest of man and not the other way around. So that's a key document which I think has been quite sort of influential in my political thinking, certainly over more recent years. And I was introduced to it by, I guess, my choice for the contemporary figure, which is Maurice Glassman, who's the founder of Blue Labour and a good friend, I'm pleased to say. And he has been articulating that kind of politics within the labour movement for many years, and I think it's been proved right time and again. So those are the two figures with very much a sort of crossover between them.
So let's go back to Pope Leo, and we can get into Maurice Glassman in a moment, because he's someone I'm very interested to talk about. I can't say I know a whole lot about Pope Leo XIII. I do know he was Pope. So from the late 19th century to the very early 20th.
Yeah, and I can't say I know an awful lot about him as an individual or even as a pope particularly, but certainly, this particular encyclical, which has stood the test of time, and actually, influenced things like the big London dock strike, and that whole it was Cardinal Manning who was a prominent archbishop of the Catholic Church at the time of the dock strike. Or I should say, actually, I think that's the other way around. I said influenced the dock strike. I think was influenced by Cardinal Manning and his involvement in the London dock strike. And at a time, the late 19th century, where workers really were treated as cattle and as fodder, and worked in the most crushing and challenging of conditions often. To have someone like the Pope come out and say, actually, we need to campaign for justice in the workplace. We need to endorse trade unions and what they campaign for. Talks about strike action being used as a last resort, but designing economies in the interest of man, as I said, and not the other way around. Is in some respect quite revolutionary at the time.
And that's a man who can galvanize millions of people. So with that does come a duty of care. You could almost say anything really, and some Catholics would, or some people would follow that as an interpretation of the word of God. So
it's papal infallibility, isn't it? So
yeah,
when they issue these pronouncements and these encyclicals, then the Catholic Church across the world is required to take it on board and apply it. So to have someone at a time where in Britain, for example, those sort of Victorian conditions that were articulated by the likes of Charles Dickens and so on. To have this great figure make that kind of pronouncement really made a difference. And as I say, it stood the test of time. It's a document really worth reading today, because as we touched on earlier, the absence of trade unions nowadays from the workplace, and things like sweatshop warehouses and zero-hours contracts, the gig economy, precarious employment. I think that that document still points the way in many respects, and I would imagine that there's probably a lot of people on the left who haven't read it and may not even know it, and people on the right as well. But I would recommend it to them.
Wonderful. And let's go on to Morris Glassman. I mean, it's sort of it makes complete sense that you'd pick him, given, as you mentioned, the Blue Labour connection. When did you first become aware of Mr. Glassman, or should I say Lord Glassman? I'm not sure. I'm not sure what you prefer.
Some years ago now, but we struck up a friendship, particularly just after the Brexit campaign. And I was arguing very similar things to what he and some of his Blue Labour colleagues had been arguing, but without ever really kind of aligning ourselves or getting involved with each other. But I'm obviously involved with the Blue Labour movement now, and I think the whole kind of message of Blue Labour about the importance of understanding the working class, the importance of social solidarity, of relationships, of cultural attachment, of reciprocity, of dignity of labour, all of this kind of stuff, which has its roots, very much in that kind of Catholic social thought, on the one hand, against a dehumanising market, but not in favour of a kind of impersonal, overbearing, overmighty state on the other hand. I think that's got an awful lot to teach. A labour movement back today is enthralled to the kind of ideology of identity politics and wokery, and parts of the liberal left that over the years were enthralled to the new global market, and how that, the impact of that, which they seem not to see in terms of the impact on social solidarity, and deindustrialization in communities, and rupturing some of the bonds that bound people together. So much, I think, of what Blue Labour and Morris have articulated have been proved right, and points the way for the Labour Party in the future. Whether or not the party takes it, I think it's a different question entirely.
Mm-hmm. And it shows a very high level of thinking, because we unfortunately we do live in a time where there's almost like a large wall that goes right through the middle of society and culture, and an issue, and thus individuals will just tend to fall on one side, and if you're on the right side, you are a conservative and a capitalist, and if you're on the left side, you're a liberal and a socialist, right? That's the archaic understanding of what it means to be political. Anyone who can sort of take the good from either side and disregard the bad from either side is a good thinker to me.
Yeah, and I'm certainly not arguing against ideology. I mean, ideology is important. I think you have to, if you're serious about influencing things in the way you want to see them change, then you have to have an ideological footing, I think, because you've got to have a platform, you've got to have a base from where to start, you've got to know where you're going. But you've also got to understand that most people, the vast majority of the public, of the electorate, don't see things in that kind of binary left-right way. And for example, at the moment, as I've argued many times, there's this huge space in politics, I think, for to a certain degree, the Tories are exploiting that space now. I think that's pretty clear, where people tax on the left on economics. They want to see a more egalitarian economy. They want to see a higher minimum wage, investment in public services, closing the gap between rich and poor, all of that sort of stuff. But on culture, they're towards the right. They believe in social solidarity. They believe in cultural attachment. They want to discuss things like immigration without being called racist and nativist and bigoted. And once upon a time, people, who were part of the political spectrum were welcomed by the Labour Party, were very happy to vote for Labour, but the Labour Party has done so much to alienate those people over the last sort of decade or two. that they've now flocked to the Tories, and that is a seismic shift in British politics, which I don't know Labour's going to be able to turn that round, frankly, and that's really disappointing from my point of view.
Do you think now, in the wake of both Corbynism and I wouldn't say Starmerism, because I don't think there's enough of a base of ideology there, but of the sort of the ostensibly more presentable version of Labour. Now that both of those have been rejected by the electorate, does that open the door for Blue Labour to come in, or do you think the ship has sailed on Labour?
I think the door was opened with the Brexit result. I think it was opened further with the 2019 general election annihilation. I think it's been opened further again with the recent results. But whether or not the movement wants to walk through the door is an entirely different question. There are lots of people in the Labour movement who are happy with comfortable opposition, frankly, who, as long as they, particularly the radical left, I would say, as long as they maintain their own purist ideology, they want to win elections, but if they lose, at least we didn't compromise on anything. At least we stayed true to our very fixed ideology. Well, that's fine if you want to be a pressure group. It's not fine if you want to try and build the coalition of the left that's necessary to win power. And there are too few people, I think, from that element of the left that are motivated by the importance of winning power. So, I've argued recently, I don't think either the liberal left or the radical left of the Labour Party, which pretty much dominate the party between the two of them, have understood what it takes to reconnect with the working class. I think they've both, for various reasons, been responsible for alienating the working class from the party, and for the most part have not learned the lessons of it. And we saw that again with the recent local election results, where Labour lost Hartlepool and other places where you would expect it even now to dominate. So it's a paradigm shift in British politics, and I think that many people on the left still haven't grasped it, or if they have, just shrug their shoulders and kind of carry on arguing what they've been arguing for so many years.
With when your book came out, which I very much enjoyed, by the way, there was a very ironic response, which is, so you wrote a book about how I suppose the institutionalized left in Britain has this it's just a sort of a disgust response at working class grievances, and in response you were met with snobbery and slander, really, by the sort of people. It's almost like they had a race to see who could prove your point the fastest.
Some of it was ridiculous, to be honest. Some of the criticism came from people who hadn't read the book and probably had no intention of reading it, and some prominent people on the left who said it was a far right tract, and it was a fascist manifesto, and this is not the path that Labour should go down. It's just complete nonsense. Anyone who reads the book will see that actually, it makes economically, it makes an argument for the democratic socialism, for a radical recalibration of the economy in favour of ordinary working people, reinvigorating manufacturing and creating thousands of blue-collar jobs, and being willing to challenge the forces of globalization and neoliberalism and reordering things in favour of ordinary working people, but simply while understanding the politics of belonging, and the politics of social solidarity. And not doing too much to violate that, because if you do, you disorientate people and you drive them into the hands of opponents. So that's the basis of the book, really.
That's the key part. You talk about in your hometown how the makeup of the town was altered almost irreversibly by mass immigration, and in response there was a surge for the British National Party, right?
Yeah, and they came out of nowhere. I mean, they came out in 2006, the BNP, they'd won one seat on the council in 2004. Before that, they had not come anywhere near to penetrating the borough. They'd got a foothold in other parts of East London, in Tower Hamlets and places like that, but they'd never come near Barking and Dagenham. But in a few short years, a place that was overwhelmingly Labour elected 12 BNP councillors, and they formed the official opposition on the local council in the elections in 2006. It was their best ever performance in local government, and it was simply because local people were not racist or nativist, but things were happening around them. The impacts of globalization in the first decade of this century, the impacts of the acute effects in terms of deindustrialization and rapid demographic change, and people were saying, hold on a second, what's happening around me? It was their sense of order that had been violated rather than their sense of race. But politicians across the piece, particularly of the left, didn't understand that. They lectured them about the importance of, improving GDP by having open borders. And they lectured them about, cultural enrichment and all of that. And people went, well, if that's what you're going to do, we'll vote for the BNP. And parts of the left still haven't understand those lessons today. They refuse to understand.
Yeah, and that's the thing that I found most dishonest about the polemics. The polemics against your book, where people were the same old trite of saying it was a far right text, but what it struck me as is basically being just a warning. If you don't address these concerns, then it's you who's going to create this reaction, not me writing this book.
And I say to people, take it from me. I'm somebody on the left. I've been in the Labour Party for nearly 27 years. I've been an active trade unionist for pretty much all of that time. I'm someone who believes in the left and wants to see all of the social and economic injustices come to an end that we constantly campaign against on the left. So take it from me that this is what's happening in communities like my one during that time. And if you don't take it from me, you will end up having to listen to potentially far right or populist parties who, like they did in Barking and Dagenham, tap into that alienation. But at the moment, it's a message that is very, very difficult to get through on the left, and that's why the left is in the mess that it's in, frankly.
What gives you pride to be working class?
I think, going back to Barking and Dagenham and the community that I grew up in, there's an awful lot of social solidarity in those places where there was a kind of, unwritten moral code where, people were expected to live by certain rules, and where there aren't huge differences in wealth in a community, people feel that they have that, social and cultural connection. I think that's synonymous with trade unionism, the importance of not crossing picket lines. An injury to one is an injury to all. United we stand, divided we fall. All of that kind of thing. And, the history of the working class movement in this country, nothing was ever given to the working class on the plate. They had to organise, they had to fight for it, they had to do it by standing together. And that's the best of the working class for me, and that's why I'm proud to be part of that movement.
Paul Embery, that was Your Life in 10.
Thank you.
Cheers.